Good afternoon. Welcome to the Studebaker Theater and the Chicago International Puppet Theater Festival's second panel of the Ellen von Valkenburg Puppetry Symposium. My name is Blair Thomas, and I'm the artistic director of the festival. And along with my colleague Paulette, we have planned these panel discussions. And just to say, we will go for till about 3:15 with this presentation of the three artists and our topic today, the grand narratives and petit récits. It's going to be a presentation of their work, and at the very end we'll have a question and answer period, and this microphone right here will be a place where you can come up and speak. So, Paulette Richards, the moderator for today, survived a 10-month stint in Senegal as a 2013-2014 Fulbright scholar without contracting any tropical diseases. But sometime during her service as an artist in residence at the Institut Français de St. Louis, the puppet bug bit her hard. After returning to Atlanta, she became a docent in the Worlds of Puppetry Museum at the Center for Puppetry Arts. And when fellow members of the Decatur Makers introduced her to the Adrena microprocessors and the stepper motors, she immediately thought of the animatronic dogs and dozers in the Henson Gallery of the museum and began designing her own rudimentary robots. Richards has taught animatronic puppetry workshops at Decatur Makers, the DeKalb Country Public Library, the Center for Puppetry Arts, and the Puppeteers of America 2017 National Festival. During the 2017-2018 academic year, she worked for Georgia Tech's Center for Education, integrating science, math, and computing as an innovator in residence at the Hollis Innovation Academy. Her mission in this encore career is to engage students who might not otherwise see themselves as innovators in STEM disciplines through animatronic puppetry. But in addition to that, Paulette was trained as a dancer, but she has performed as a puppeteer and has been an educator for a long time in many different fields. Now, in the field of puppetry, she is one of the teachers who teaches classes online through the Puppet Festival. So you can find out about our workshops and classes on our website, and she will tell you about the one she's teaching this spring. But the past year, she has taught a class that has allowed her to complete her research work on a book that will be published shortly by Routledge entitled Object Performance in the Black Atlantic, the United States. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the microphone over to Paulette.
Thank you, Blair. So good afternoon. Welcome, and thank you for coming out. This is the second of our presentations, as Blair mentioned, and I have to be nitpicky and mention that there is a typo in our slide here. There should be grand narratives and petit récits with no P. I think that's interference from English, but we'll explain what we mean by that shortly. So this year, when we were planning these sessions, we were aware of the interest in theoretical trends around what's known as post-humanism. You may have heard the term object-oriented ontology, or agential realism, or new materialism, and other phrases in that realm. So we thought that we need to show that the Chicago International Puppet Theater Festival is cutting edge and on top of the latest theory. So I sat down with a big pile of books in September and digested what I could, and then gave Blair Apreci, and that's how we arrived at the themes for these panels. For this one, Grand Narratives and Petits Récits, we're looking in particular at a theorist named François Lyotard, who looked at the way that society develops these overarching narratives to explain who we are, what we think we're doing. We're having an enormous fight about this in the United States at the moment over what's known as critical race theory and what story we're going to tell ourselves about the history of slavery. Lyotard's response to these overarching narratives is that the way to get at the truth is to look at the small, local stories, so petits récits. And as it happened, we had a number of shows on the slate for this festival that were adaptations of well-known grand narratives, Frankenstein, Hamlet, etc. And so we wanted to look at what the puppet shows were doing with them, because one thing that puppets do is scale. So what happens when you put a grand narrative like Moby Dick into a puppet form? And then, you know, the way that things work out because of people's rehearsal and performance schedules, it doesn't line up neatly, but we can still tie the shows that are going to be presented on the panel today to the overarching topic. So the format is going to be that each of our presenters will have 15 to 20 minutes to tell you all about their work, and then I will do the work of weaving what they have said into our general theme, and then we'll open the floor at the end for questions from the audience, which we are very much anticipating. So without further ado, I will move into the introduction of our first panelist, Sarah Fornés. So let me pull up the bio, and I'm trying to keep all the ugliness off my computer because it's the projector, so I'm now reading from the Google Drive on my phone. Sarah Fornés is a co-artistic director of Manual Cinema. She has worked as a director, performer, choreographer, writer, and story artist on numerous theater, immersive museum, and film projects for Manual Cinema. Most recently, she has devised and directed both a film and live show adaptation of Mo Willems' Leonardo and Sam books, which were featured at the Kennedy Center and off-Broadway at the New Victory Theater, respectively. Her puppetry with Manual Cinema has been featured in films including a production of Oedipus Rex, another grand narrative, with LA Opera, and the new Candyman remake directed by Nia Da Costa and produced by Jordan Peele. Outside of Manual Cinema, Sarah has worked with Red Moon Theater, Looking Glass Theater Company, Court Theater, and Blair Thomas and Company. Sarah wrote the story mode and the original character backstories for the video game Rivals of Aether, as well as directed their 2021 Rivals direct release, in which she created a loving Rivals-based homage to The Muppet Show. In 2017, she directed and edited the first episode of the web series The Doula Is In. In 2016, she directed and devised an Animotion, live motion capture production of Shakespeare's Hamlet, more grand narratives, for Hamlet's scene at Kronborg Castle in Elsinore, Denmark. So I'm just going to pull up her slides, and then we will hear from Sarah Fornés.
Thank you so much for that intro, Paulette. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Fornés. I'm one of the 5 co-artistic directors of Manual Cinema, and we'll be presenting our production of Frankenstein. This is a new version that hasn't been in Chicago before. We've been touring it all over North and South America, and it will land here in this theater next Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So I put together these slides to just give you a little introduction to who we are and what we do. Manual Cinema, like I said, is a collaboration between 5 people. We founded the company together. And 3 of us are on what we call the visual team. So that is, we're puppet builders, we're illustrators, we're directors, we're choreographers. We come out of like theater and visual arts backgrounds. And then the other 2 members are who we call the sound and music team. So they are classical musicians, composers, sound designers trained on, stereo sound installations. So storytellers through, the auditory senses. And in the collaboration between us, that is Manual Cinema. I thought I would start with just a brief, like a very short, like maybe 2-minute long trailer to give you a sense of what we do before taking it apart. But in essence, what we do, if I were to summarize it, is we make movies live on stage in front of people. So we use the art of puppetry, primarily shadow puppetry and paper puppets, to create what looks like a live movie in front of your eyes. Often we try not to use words, even when telling grand narratives. And if that's the visual side, the other half, which does an equal share of the storytelling, is the sonic side. So there's always live bands on stage in a Manual Cinema show, and surround sound, like you would see at a theater. So even though our puppets are primarily 2-dimensional, the sound is immersive. It's one of the only mediums that travels through your cells, right, through the vibration of your body to happen. So that is very 3D to match the 2D visuals. So let's watch a bit of the trailer so you can see what that is, and then we'll talk a little bit about it.
Okay, is that incorporated into the slideshow?
Yes, if you just click on that, and
Okay.
it should go full screen.
It's coming. Here we go, all right.
Oh, we hooked up to sound?
Yeah, we were. Dismiss.
Drinking ice
We have
water
to watch
flushes
commercial
out
first.
belly.
That's why.
People are flushing.
Is that it?
That's it.
Okay.
So this is just a brief trailer for one of our older shows that shows you the images in motion. So Manual Cinema, we've been around and telling stories for 12 and a half years. I guess we're in our middle school years now. And we've always been interested in how can we tell stories and emotionally connected stories about empathy without using spoken dialogue or without using very much language. We've started to use language more in recent years, but the goal at the beginning was not to use any spoken language at all. And can we use the language of Western cinema, the language of mise-en-scène, of far shots, mediums, close-ups, the language of montage and camera movement in conjunction with, with musical storytelling to tell our stories. And that's kind of what we set out to do. At the very beginning, Julia Miller, who was working with myself at Red Moon, had an idea for a story. And speaking of grand narratives, I think she had the idea after reading Joseph Campbell and about the hero's journey, which is about as grand narrative as you can get. And she was like, I've had this idea about this young woman who lives in a satellite array and goes on a spirit quest after hearing this music, this song that like captures her soul, only to find perhaps an emptiness at the heart of what she's seeking. And she described what sounded like a short film. And I was like, wow, that sounds incredible. It sounds like an incredible film. And then she would have said, I found this overhead projector in my landlord's garage. I don't even think he knows he has it. What if we take it or borrow it and make a show? And I was like, well, actually, very conveniently, my boyfriend is an illustrator and a dramaturg and a writer. Like, he should come on board. And she was like, great, I was just at this house party and I heard this incredible band. And I feel like they are the sound of the Spirit Quest. And I was like, perfect. And then that was how Manual Cinema was born. So we made this short 20-minute show called The Ballad of Lula Del Rey that was about that kernel that Julia came up with. And it was we used one overhead projector, and we had a screen. Her boyfriend at the time was a violin maker and made us this like amazing and heavy screen out of wood. And the guys had their guitars and a box to cue sounds. And we essentially performed this 20-minute shadow puppet piece anywhere people would let us in. So we did a lot of bars because we were touring with people who knew how to tour like a band. And bars usually have electricity to plug your overhead projector in. So we did bars, we did empty storefronts, we did windows of park districts, we did a lot of house parties. And people started asking us, what are you going to do next? And we thought, oh, what a great question. We hadn't thought of that. So we started working on our next show, which the final version of is what you saw in that trailer, Ada Ava. And in this show, we kind of started something that Manual Cinema does a lot now, which is looking at specific filmmakers together. When we get an idea for a story, we'll just go and watch a lot of movies. And like watch movies that feel like they're related to either a sense of place or an emotion or a character. So Ada Ava was Drew's Kernel, who's another artistic director. He was working on the Comedy of Errors at Court Theater, and he thought to himself, this is a comical farce, but if you actually change the time signature, there's like true horror at the heart of being mistaken for someone else and not knowing it, not realizing what's happening and having other people accuse you of things you haven't done. Like the horror kind of at the heart of this twin-based comedy. At the same time, he was watching his grandmother had just died, and his grandmother and grandfather, had been married since they were teens, and he was watching his grandfather move through a life that he built as a two-person partnership alone for the first time. And he kind of put those ideas together and came up with this psychological horror puppet show about a twin losing her sister in her 80s, and then undergoing kind of like a Vertigo-style psychic break. So we premiered this show in our front window on Halloween. We used to live at an apartment that was right off of Damon Avenue where all the bars are. So we were like, this is great, everyone's gonna be coming to party. Maybe we can make them watch our puppet show. So we like sunk some speakers in the bushes out front, and we started the show with this like giant clap of like lightning and thunder, which actually now we start a lot of our shows like that because we find it's like very effective to get people to like look at the screen. So it made people stop and like wander over on their way to the bar and watch. Again, we started this out as like a 15-20 minute piece. We then performed it in a funeral hall, a former funeral parlor in Logan Square. And this is a pretty good example of what our shows looked like at the beginning, kind of like a traditional shadow puppet show. So we had overhead projectors that are kind of hidden behind the screen. The band is also hidden behind the screen with us. And when people watched the shows, they were like, okay, that was interesting. But why was that movie so slow? And like, why were there those times where there was just blackouts? And what is that flashing lights we see? We thought we were very clever, and we were like, aha, we shall do something that we've seen Blair and Redmoon do, which is puppet time. After we do the show for everyone, then we'll invite them backstage and show them our secrets. We'll hand them the puppets and say, this was all done live. And so we did that for like a year or so. But I truly don't think that if that was still how we tell our stories, that manual cinema would be around anymore. But we kind of came to this really fortuitous accident of we were booked to play like a really big space, Theater on the Lake, before it was renovated. And it was a thrust stage, and we couldn't perform behind the screen. If we did that, half the audience would miss the show. So we were like, okay, we have to solve this problem. Why don't we put our screens for our shows can't get too big. They're about 6 feet by 9 feet, so that their relationship to the human body is a medium shot. So like my relationship to the screen, I'm in kind of knees up, medium shot. So we thought, let's put a camera on the screen so we can project it really big above, and then people will be able to see it. So if you go to the next slide. And then once we did that, we were like, oh, actually, this is what we're doing. So we projected our image really large above, like a movie theater. Not inventing anything new. And then below, we actually turned around our screen because we came into this happy accident of realizing this is what we've been trying to do all along, which was to make a movie that people can watch, but to create like a live human experience. So at any moment, you can look down from the big screen and see 6 people and 500 pieces of paper and 3 people with like 9 instruments, like sweating and dropping things and sprinting around in this kind of mess, to in real time, in the 1 hour we have in the theater together, to like make this story unfold in front of your eyes. And so I think happening onto this is kind of why manual cinema is still around, and it got us really excited on like, okay, this is what we do as human, in the room with other people theater, that live movie, in the theater. So we started exploding out from there. We made shows like Mementos Mori that once we had 1 camera, we were like, why not add 2? And so that allowed us to quick cut, but because the technology wasn't tied to something at the heart of the storytelling, it didn't feel like it totally gelled for us. And then we worked on a show called The End of TV. And for that one, we asked, okay, what are some other ways we can stage cinema, and in this case, TV live? And we realized that TV wants like a fleetness and a disposableness. So we set up a live green screen. So we used paper puppets and a live green screen to essentially create this TV world. And it tied into the story because one of the main characters has dementia, and the interiority of her dementia is pieced together of TV commercials. She's addicted to QVC, so her interiority is actually all created in this increasingly surrealistic TV world. And then last but not least, we kind of exploded the most what we think manual cinema means in one of our newest shows, Frankenstein, the one that will be here today. So in this show, just like in our very first shows, we have a bed of overhead projectors. They're focused on a screen. But now we use the space in front of the shadow screen and just put a light on the actors to create another playing space. We found Frankenstein was a really good narrative for us to approach because the book is a series of frames. So in the book, it starts with a sea captain who's been out, stuck in the ice for far too long. It's going a little crazy, and encounters a man stumbling across the ice. And as soon as he encounters this man, he starts saying, like, finally a gentleman, finally someone for me to talk to. I've been stranded for so long. So you get the sense that maybe you shouldn't trust the sea captain's account of this man. And that man turns out to be Victor Frankenstein. So then you get Victor Frankenstein's story in his own words, his account of what he's done. And then at the very heart of the story, you get the creature in their own words, speaking about their experience. And so that inspired us to say, okay, how do we approach each layer of this story through a different visual idiom? How do we make a different manual cinema for each layer? So we started, ours doesn't start with a sea captain, but instead with Mary Shelley, which is the next slide. So the framing story is actually based on Mary Shelley's own words. Her introduction, she published the novel in 1818 anonymously, and then in 1832, she needed money. She republished it, and she republished it under her own name with a foreword. And in her foreword, she said, Byron didn't write this. My husband Percy didn't write this. Godwin, my father, didn't write this. This is my hideous progeny. I'm responsible for this. Furthermore, it was inspired by a nightmare I had after I lost my first baby, and she lost multiple children and multiple pregnancies. And she said, I had a dream that I brought my baby back to life by rubbing its limbs and using the electricity to life to bring it back. And that's what inspired this story for me. And for Manual Cinema, that's what inspired our entry point into it. So we start in shadow, which feels like the most emotionally true medium to us, to tell the story of Mary Shelley's loss of her first daughter. Then from Mary Shelley's story, we go into Victor Frankenstein, which is the next slide. And for that, we use silent movies because there's like an artifice to silent cinema. There's like a chewing of the furniture and over-the-topness that we felt got at some of that untrustworthiness of Victor. Some of the stuff that Mary Shelley was doing in the book to make you question his narrative, we tried to do that through the way that we do those shots. So again, everything is still made of paper, everything is still live, but it feels like silent film. And you can see in the next shot a little bit of how we do that, which is just with like bits of puppets moving around in front of the screen. And then the last and kind of most important part, the heart of the show, is the story of Victor Frankenstein's creature. And their story in the show, if you can see the next one, starts with a small tabletop puppet. And we really wanted to get at a sense of intimacy and also a sense of what the trauma is of being born into the world, and that being born into the world and then immediately having people react with violence against you, immediately having people look at you and reject you, and not have anyone there to nurture you, not have anyone there to explain what's going on after you've been kind of thrust and forced into life. So we made the puppet about the size of Mary Shelley's lost baby, because the creature in that moment is a baby, is new into the world. And we use a lot of POV shots and really intimate camera angles. And for that to work, Myra and I use a moving camera for the first time. Before, we thought manual cinema meant the camera always had to stay still and the puppets moved. But instead, we picked up the camera because we realized we needed to get in close to the creature, and the camera needed to follow the creature's movement, and not vice versa. So I think I'm at 15. Well, I'll really quickly, so that is what we do live, and that's how we started and what we love. And then another big part of what we do, especially today, is now we make cinema. Now we make puppetry for film. And just kind of like Jim Henson said, it's a totally different medium. We go by the Jim Henson principle, which is that you can make the puppets infinitely complex. They only need to be right once, because then you have it in the can. So the way we build puppets, the way we think about storytelling and storyboarding is entirely different. So one of our first videos that we made, and we've done a lot of work in documentary, was The Forger, actually based on a gentleman who just died, but about his work in World War II, forging documents, especially for children, to escape Nazi-occupied France. We had the extreme privilege to work with Nia DaCosta on Candyman, and for that, specifically at her request, we put in a lot of wires. That's just the one before it. Yeah, that one. We used a lot of wires, and we used a lot of visible hands, because Nia was very interested in foregrounding that these aren't animation, but these are puppets, and that there are outside forces controlling and pulling on them. As you see the characters, various historical characters and characters in the mythology of the movie undergoing intense circumstances. We also started working not in shadow, which was fun. All of a sudden, we're like, faces. What? Who knew? I mean, everyone knew that faces were expressive, but we figured it out a couple of years ago. And so we started drawing puppets and making sets for them, and it kind of gave us a new avenue to follow. And again, we're trying to use the language of cinema. And the Poetry Foundation approached us for about World War I poems. So we made essentially a World War I puppet movie with these puppets about that big. If you can click to the next one, you can see him in shot. So that's him in one of the stills. And this and The Forger are all free online. If you go to our website, you can see any of these films. We also got to work with Jamil and Ayanna Woods and Eve Ewing and Nate Marshall on a short inspired by Gwendolyn Brooks's We Real Cool, and that's the next one. And that we started playing with like layered paper for that. So this is a flashback shot in black and white, so we just made the puppets black and white. But all of those buildings behind are individual and gives you this kind of sense of place. Once we got into collage, it kind of opened up a whole world. We also adapted some Whitman poems. And Walt Whitman was one of the most photographed mans of his day. He was really like an icon. And there's incredible archives of that. So we made hundreds of puppets, all based on Walt Whitman's photographs. We like printed them out, we cut them out, we jointed them. So there are all these like new movable Walt Whitmans. Yeah, and it's been kind of joyous to get to work with historical characters because there is this, and people, because there's all this material around the way they looked and the way they moved. The next is Gwendolyn Brooks, which we did in a kind of a more brightly colored cartoon aesthetic with Eve and Nate. And then the next is just to give a sense of how this puppetry works. So how the film puppetry works is that kind of for each second, kind of like Leica does with stop motion, where they'll make like dozens of faces. We'll just make dozens and dozens of puppets for each face and each gesture and like rapidly cut and switch them out. So this is just a pile of puppets. So that's pretty much our process. And that's my like behind the scenes and who Manual Cinema is and what we think about. Thank you so much.
Thank you, that was wonderful. Let me get my tech together here so that I can introduce Mike Olean. So Mike Olean, I've said it right?
It's like Napoleon without
Napoleon, okay. Mike Olean is a director, artist, and technologist working in the field of puppetry. Through his work, he seeks to foster fellowships between artists through collaborative play and to imbue objects with uncanny life. He is a co-artistic director of Rough House and has created a number of immersive puppet-haunted houses in Chicago, which currently go by the title House of the Exquisite Corpse. Other works include Invitation to a Beheading, mask and puppet design, Ubu the King, where he was the director, and for 6 years, Mike co-curated Nasty, Brutish, and Short, a Puppet Cabaret, which he continues to produce at Lynx Hall. So that is our next presenter, and let me open up his slide presentation. And take it away.
Cool. Well, hi, folks. So my name is Mike Olean, and I am one of the co-artistic directors of Rough House. Rough House is a puppet organization whose mission is to create puppet art that celebrates the weird things that make us unique and the weirder things that bring us together. We started out as a couple of fellow UCLA graduates who Los Angeles is fucking weird, and we wanted to go where the theater was because we thought that's what we went to school for. So we all moved out to Chicago, and we lived in the basement of what we made into a storefront theater that we called the Rough House. So that was for about 2 years, and sort of something that's been essential to Rough House has always been sort of like interdisciplinary collaboration and community, and so it's always had a somewhat like hodgepodgey sort of aesthetic because it's often been sort of the product of whoever is in the room at any given moment. So we started out where the Rough House itself wasn't necessarily puppetry focused, but there was, I think we were particularly interested in in including puppets there ended up being sort of a lot of music, a lot of poetry, sort of constantly found its way to things. And I think that, so I think what I'm interested in talking about today is some of the things that sort of keep on reasserting themselves in our company that has been around for about 12 years now. We've really grown up side by side with manual cinema, and our paths have interwoven in so many different ways. It's really funny to see some of the photos where it's like they were. I will show you one that is in the exact same space, the same funeral parlor. So anyway, so we started out kind of as very sort of hodgepodgey. Oh, and the other thing that really sort of kept on reasserting itself is performance art, which is, I think, distinctly, there is something that is almost always distinctly non-narrative about what we do. We really, I think, it could be somewhat to do, there's certainly a lot of neurodivergent folks in our particular crew, and I think that finding one's path in a single narrative is often very challenging for us. So much of the work that we create involves sort of reaching out into whatever is grabbing us in the moment and incorporating it into things. Ready for the next one? This is from one of our first shows that includes, we had sort of a reboot in about 2013 where Claire Sachs and Kay Crone joined us as co-artistic directors of the company. And this was the first show that we did together, which is Into the Uncanny Valley. And this sort of speaks to one of the first things that really keeps on, whether we like it or not, reasserting itself into our work. And that is, there's the uncanniness, and there's sort of this otherness that is, really kind of unavoidable for us. So I'd like you to imagine, briefly, you are a puppeteer, and as a puppeteer, you are sort of we'll say a transphasic surgeon, and that you can just sort of reach your hand inside of a human being and pull out an aspect of themselves. And it could be any aspect. It does have to be essential. It could be a hope, a dream, a fear, a memory, a misremembering, or you could just try and pull out the entire thing, and literally have a doppelganger of oneself separated from the original. And I think that's something that we often keep coming back to. And so another thing that is sort of a recurring theme for us is death. Because the puppet itself is in its own nature it is an inert object. It's an inert object that is entirely dependent on its human operator for life. And with that theme, you really can't escape it. Whenever you are doing a puppet show, there is just sort of like, there's both the presence of death, and with the presence of death comes this sort of inherent awareness of the preciousness of life and how fleeting it is. And one thing that we really love about puppetry is that it is always this, no matter what show you're doing, if it's, from Sesame Street to Frankenstein, you've got, there is always somewhere on this continuum of how delicate and precious life is and how inevitable death is, And so, here, ready for the next one? So it can exhibit itself as particularly cute. I mean, I don't know if you necessarily find this cute, but I certainly do. This is Squid Baby, sort of an informal mascot of the company. And I think when you look at one end of the spectrum and when you when you focus on the light, puppetry is, it is empathetic and it is endearing. And it has just sort of like baked into its very existence this care for this incredible little miracle that has, popped up for between 5 minutes and an hour long, or however long the puppet show is. I get squirmy after an hour, so we try and keep things short. And so we have, on the one hand, we have life of the object, and then on the next one, we have death. We have that other element that lives inside of us, and when you look at it through the dark lens, through the shadow, you have puppets are, it is either endearing that you can bring them up to life, or utterly horrifying that you can bring them out of death. This sort of impermeable barrier that no human ever wants to cross. And so these are sort of the strengths that we find ourselves constantly playing with in puppetry, is both that sort of like endearing nature and also the delightful horror that they can conjure. And what's sort of interesting about some of these, the scarier puppets, is that the more time you spend with them, the more endearing they become. They lose their haunting power, which is, it's almost, we have spent so many times trying to avoid that, trying to avoid this sort of like cutification that starts to happen over time. And if you could believe it, if you spend enough time with this faceless monster, as we do in our, so Rough Houses, we've been producing these collaborative haunted houses over the last couple of years, 5-6 years now. And what happens is that when you're hanging out inside of a haunted house, and if you have access to the puppets, if there's no barrier between you, they lose their frighteningness, which is, it's really, I don't know, just kind of like this sublime effect of that there is, it's like almost like you can't even fight the empathy that starts to develop in in this weird puppety stew pot that you're hanging out in. So let's see. Yeah. So here we have a nice little a puppet, one of our many puppets that was really sort of like meant to be horrifying and really ended up being kind of just endearing instead. So yeah, this is another one of the haunted houses. And lately the haunted houses have actually switched to, they've become a real blend of so many of the different things that we do. So we've inherited Nasty Brutish and Short Puppet Cabaret, which was founded by Manual Cinema's Julia Miller. And it's really become sort of a core part of the company and how the company relates to each other it becomes a platform to be able to share new work. And it's also, there's a fantastic puppet expression which is too short to suck, which we live and die by. That sort of short format that the cabaret provides is a really excellent frame for creating, for us, for the Puppet Haunted House now. And so the haunted house as it currently exists is entirely peep shows. So what one does is you walk through the space and there is a box that you approach, and there's holes in the exterior of the box, and you put on headphones. And for the next 5 minutes, you hold your eyes up to the holes and watch a puppet horror unfold. and what's really exciting to us about this is that it gives the individual puppeteers total creative control over their itsy bitsy little domain, which is, I don't know, there's just something so nice about sharing in particular that we constantly keep coming back to in creating these, because, you know, within the confines of the box, people can go absolutely wild with their own particular vision, and then just next door, somebody can be doing something completely different. And just by the sheer fact of putting them side by side, and also in part of the creation, they start to have a conversation with one another. And narrative doesn't necessarily need to be tied to an existing story in that case, because what happens is the audience starts to create a narrative of their own, and you inevitably start to piece the things together, which is sort of where this Exquisite Corpse idea comes from for us, is that Exquisite Corpse it's an absurdist or surrealist drawing game where you draw one part of a body, you fold it over, pass it to your neighbor, and then they draw another part of the body without even knowing what's on the other side of it. And then you get this either creepy or preciously delightful figure that's waiting for you at the end, or some combination of both, as our stuff often is. So we've got light, death, inescapable empathy, and we can do the next one. So this is the one that's in that exact same funeral parlor, and I really love this particular image because I don't know, there is just such connection that is happening between human and puppet, and in that pulling a part of oneself out and being able to examine it, and also to realize how precious that thing is, it really does sort of open up this intuitive awareness that, like, the other is the self and the self is the other, and boundaries do certainly exist, and they keep us from getting sucked out into space. Boundaries sometimes are very good, but sometimes we accidentally create them, and puppets are great because they don't mind that, and they kind of just go trudging through. All right, so then the other thing that often sort of finds its way into a lot of our work is, ready for the next one, is these sort of power dynamics. Power dynamics are often, that is another theme that continually asserts itself, whether we like it or not, in puppetry. And I'm sure because there's just sort of the factor of, there's words like manipulate, control, master of puppets. And master of puppets, I think, is something that does like a really supreme disservice to puppetry and puppeteers and people's sort of understanding of how it works, because anybody who's jiggled a puppet or tried to control it or have it do exactly what they want, it is a fool's game. You cannot master a puppet. If you want to work with a puppet, be a collaborator with the puppet. Puppets, based on the way that they are designed, based on how heavy it is, how far its head turns, the space that you have to put in between, like just like creating sight lines. There are certain things that the puppet starts to assert its own, what feels like, desires. There are things that they're good at, there's things that they're bad at, there's things that they will absolutely not do under any circumstances. And that's really just part of it. And so that narrative of control is another one that reasserts itself, in that, to be a good puppeteer, I think that, and it's taken me a very long time to realize this, is that, like, you have to be a servant to the puppet. You've got to, you have to facilitate its life, and you have to foster it, and you have to do your gosh dang best to be able to make it happen. So this piece is one of our shows called Ubu the King. Ubu Wa, created by Alfred Jarry, sort of a pre-absurdist work about a shitty man and his shitty wife, and they love to gobble power and ruin everything in the process. And so for the next one, and so here's a little screen cap of it in motion, which I think Ubu loves to remind us that that we are not the master of the puppets. If we are indeed puppeteers, like, we rely on the puppet for a job. And so in that sense, it's really up to us to do it service, to imbue it, and to share as much of our life force as we possibly can. And that power dynamic can be what happens when the puppet takes too much life force out of you. You know, when does the relationship tip over from balance into parasitism? So we explored that with Ubu, which then I guess kind of brings us to our show that we have in the festival, Invitation to a Beheading, which is it's adapted from a novel by Vladimir Nabokov. And Michael Brown, they're rehearsing it right now, which is why I get to be on the panel. Michael Brown is a performer and a physical theater artist. And since I know that the show, I believe, is already sold out, I can reveal to you that it is probably more of a mask show than a puppet show. But we snuck into the festival anyway. And I think that it's been exciting to work with the masks in particular, because if we go back to sort of my initial image of being able to reach inside of a human and to be able to pull out an aspect and turn it into a puppet, a mask feels very much like if you stopped halfway through, and while the puppet's still stuck inside of the human's face, it looks a lot like a mask. So that's how we've sort of rehearsed and treated this show. And I think that the masks themselves really inhabit so many of all of the great elements of puppetry, in that they can be something entirely outside of ourselves, and likewise they can be something that is so human. And in this particular show, they represent, I mean, like, despite the fact that they're smiling, they're not particularly nice masked characters. So that's been, I think that's where we've gotten to in terms of beheading. And then here's another picture of beheading. And here we have very similarly, sort of this power dynamic that is happening, where it's, you know, who is the master and who is the puppet? The relationship is far more flexible than I think we often give it credit for. All right, and that is my very long journey across everything. All right, thanks.
Great. Okay, thank you so much. So many rich themes there that we will return to. And finally, we have Theodora Skipetaris. I'm just pulling up the slides, and then I will give you the bio, and we'll be off to the races again. Yes, lovely Google Drive, okay? So Theodora Skipetaris is an interdisciplinary artist and theater director based in New York. Trained as a sculptor and theater designer, she began creating solo performances in the late 1970s, which involved the use of handmade objects worn on her body. Gradually, she moved away from autobiography to explore social and historical themes. She introduced three-dimensional representations of herself into these performances, which she understood later to be puppets. She has created 30 works featuring as many as 300 puppet figures, live music, film, video, and documentary text. Her visual work has been exhibited widely in the US, Europe, and Asia. She has worked frequently in India, as well as in Vietnam, Cambodia, Korea, Turkey, Iran, Brazil, and Greece. Skipetaris teaches puppetry at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn. A very warm welcome to Theodora Skipetaris.
Can you all hear me? So I'm really excited to be in Chicago because I've always thought that Chicago had this incredible dynamic theater environment and also visual art environment. And, you know, I don't know what it is about the city, but it's always had a really big impact in those two areas. So I suppose it's kind of natural that we see a lot of puppetry as well. I'm going to do a really very personal take on kind of my trajectory. And I just wanted to read about something that sort of addresses the idea of a grand narrative or how you put together something. So as I look back on the things that I made as a child, I see myself as a stitcher. My mother and her 4 sisters were expert seamstresses using skills learned in Greece. Either with a sewing machine or a hand needle, I was always creating objects, mostly to wear. So those are kind of my origins. So I've always been stitching little things together. So the idea of making a well-made play, I mean, never ever crossed my mind. So I guess I've always been butting up against the idea of a grand narrative. Anyway, let's look at some of my work from the very beginning. I believe an artist's destiny is so tied up with where they're from or where they were living when their kind of formative years were happening. So I was in New York City in the 70s when the city was a total ruin and real estate was worthless and it was broken and kind of dangerous to live there. But the great thing about being there at the time was that you could take space. People were offering, landlords had abandoned their buildings, so you were offered pretty big spaces just to take the building over and do whatever you wanted. And so this kind of cooked up into a very collaborative, very shared, very innovative number of years that brought forward new possibilities for performance, where people from very many different disciplines were coming together to experiment. And a lot of this experimentation took place in a neighborhood called Soho. And I remember being in school, in graduate school, and I remember walking down to Soho, and you could walk down on a Monday night or a Tuesday night, and there were storefronts that people had taken over, and you could just walk into a storefront and you would see a chemist collaborating with a dancer. I mean, there was just tremendous interdisciplinary stuff happening. And I think that was, gave a lot of people permission to just make work. And it wasn't a very judgmental community, so it was just a great place to try ideas out. Okay. So this is one of my earliest performances, which were masks cast from my face, and I was a solo performer. Okay, we can advance. I began to put together fragments of narrative. I think the funny thing about very early performance art was that they were really short pieces. Like people's works were like 15 minutes long or 20 minutes long. And they were, again, kind of collaged together, stitched together. So I was working with my body, my own body, and autobiography. And I was not alone because at that time, there was a sort of second wave of feminism, and women started being very important in early performance art, and most of us were using our body as a reference and things that were extensions of the body. So the power dynamics were different, because if you were working in theater, there was a very strict hierarchy. There was usually the male director, top of the line, top of the pyramid, and then there were the designers and the writers and everyone else around the director. But what the performance art from this period had going for it was that those power hierarchies had been sort of smashed down. And women were suddenly very important in performance art. And that was sort of very, very interesting and very energizing. So I'm certainly also a child of that too, you know. Okay. I continue to tell stories about the split in my life of being into kind of one foot in a sort of strict Greek household and one foot in a experimental American artistic world, you know? Okay. And then I had made about 30 figures, self-portraits, and they were one original clay, an original clay, and then a mold, and then I had made several of these, and they were sitting against the wall in my studio one day. And I was feeling lonely performing solo, so I just took one of these. I called them Theodora dolls. I took one of them, and I took a saw, and I cut her at the shoulders, and I cut her at the elbow, and I stitched them together, and I saw that her hand could move, and I brought her on stage with me. And eventually, I brought so many of these Theodoras on stage that I left the stage and became the director. And I was much happier because I never really liked to perform. That's another characteristic of puppeteers. Puppeteers want to be on stage, but they do not want to be the object of attention. So that's what it was. I didn't know a thing about puppetry at the time, but I knew that being in the director seat and framing and controlling certain things visually and time-wise was really, really fun. And it was way more fun than being on stage. So, okay. So I began to make very detailed, small environments with these puppets. And I found that they were really interesting in terms of documentary material or real things that happened that you read about in the newspaper or something like that. So I became interested in a kind of hyper-realism and real stories, okay? So this is early work called Micropolis, which means tiny city, and they were miniature environments with their own lighting system and little sound system. Okay. And then I began to actually come up against a grand narrative. I would look at scientists, for example, and I would want to kind of challenge them or knock them down and write counter narratives to the story of great science, for example. So this is more playful. I think Darwin was a real scientist. But anyway, this was Darwin introducing the chain of life. And Marie Curie was in this piece as well. It was called Defenders of the Code. Okay, we can move on. So this is a medieval birth. A woman's about to give birth, and the midwives say, no, you can't give birth yet. It's not auspicious. You need the right astrological moment. This is from the history of medicine, okay? I took on a giant, Robert Moses, who was one of the most powerful people that ever determined what became of New York City in the 20th century. Scale. See, scale is the greatest thing that puppetry has to offer, one of the greatest things. And it also is a great playwriting tool. You can really write a play in puppetry, maximizing the possibilities of scale. Okay, keep going. That's from the medicine show. I did a piece on the history of women in prison. Okay, we can keep going. I've gone several times to India for several months at a time, and the first time I went was in 2000, and that completely changed my work because India's stories are so old, thousands and thousands of years old, and some Indian artists do a very interesting thing. They have a tradition where they'll take a tiny sliver of a story, like the Monkey King's trip from Sri Lanka to the mainland, and they'll tell it in like 50 different ways. And that can be that little thread of a little snippet of DNA can be like so versatile and so enriched for possibilities of a story. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. I never cared about stories. I mean, I think most performance artists didn't. But suddenly, India really made me interested in stories. So, continue. So what happened was I went back to Greek stories. So I went back, they're not as old as Indians, but they're still pretty old, and they're fragments. Most of Greek plays and poems and literature are fragments. I loved that you could work with a fragment. So this is a story about Helen of Troy, who was born out of an egg. And those are humanettes, and that's such a wonderful form with your face and then a tiny little body. Okay. Great shadow theater based on Greek vase paintings. Yeah, okay. Helen of Troy. Cyclops, Odyssey, okay. Iphigenia, I became really interested in the female bunraku style, which is called Otomi bunraku. And I made, several of those. Okay, it's from Iphigenia. This is from Orestes. So I was working with plays, but not straight ahead. This chorus, you can have a lot of fun with choruses. See, and this is the chorus of Medea with these giant heads and their bodies, the rest of their body. Okay, so this play was based on the women of Troy, and I used 4 contemporary activists around the world, and I sort of found a way to work with the 4 heroes of women of Troy. And this is when I discovered that scale was a playwriting tool, because I didn't know how to I felt the women activists today were so much more interesting than the Greek women from before. I thought, how can I do that? So scale did it. I made, the activists were 13-foot puppets, and they had bodies, and the traditional Greek characters came out of their bellies every time they entered and exited. And I found that scale helped me in a way that I could have never imagined if I were working with human actors and doing a production of the Trojan Women. Okay. Another moment from the Trojan Women. And you see the scale shifts. Puppets that are almost life-size, and humans, and then the giants. Lysistrata, okay. The chorus from Prometheus. So I did many Greek plays for a while. Prometheus, yeah. Okay. I did a version of The Chairs where the chairs were performers and they were puppets. They were performing objects. Gertrude Stein. Okay. Stephen Hawking. Okay. I did take on Pirandello's 6 characters. Okay. Lorca. Okay, so this was about police killings in the last 10 years. And I made books first of each incident that I wanted to document, and then I translated them into performing objects. Can we go further? This was Amadou Diallo, who was one of the people killed in New York City, actually, in the early 2000s. That's, okay. These were the books that inspired the performances. Okay, can we go ahead? Sean Bell was another guy killed on the eve before his wedding. These are, okay, this is Philando Castile from Minneapolis. And they were books that I translated life-size. Okay. Sandra Bland. Keep going. Eric Garner. All of these are Eric Garner. And then this is a group of high school students I worked with, and they went to a school called Benjamin Banneker High School, and there was a great African-American scientist in the 1800s named Benjamin Banneker, so we did a piece about him with a marching band. Keep going. It's a moment from the story of Benjamin Banneker. That's Benjamin Banneker. And the marching band inside of the production, okay? And this is the current production, Grand Panorama right now, which actually is about the story of photography and especially its connection to Frederick Douglass. He was the most photographed human of the 19th century. More photos of him were made than of Abraham Lincoln. Another moment from Grand Panorama. I think that's it.
Okay, so I've been entranced by all of the work presented, and I have to kind of surface and see what I can pull up from the depths. I think I have specific questions for each panelist instead of posing one for everybody. So first for Sarah. When I was in graduate school, we spent a whole semester in our feminist critical theory class reading a book called The Mad Woman in the Attic, which is like many different approaches to Frankenstein. And so I was interested in the way this was a story that was written by a woman and then subsumed into the popular culture as a grand narrative that had disconnected it from this whole, the whole theme of birth and death being closely attendant upon that. So did you all have a specific feminist intent in restoring Mary Shelley to the center of that narrative?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is yes. Yeah, I mean, I'm fascinated by Mary Shelley, and I feel like she does not get enough credit as the inventor of, like, science fiction. Yeah. Sometimes, you know, that goes to, like, Edgar Allan Poe much later. Yeah. And, you know, I think Mary Shelley, she was processing a lot of birth and a lot of death and a lot of loss. And there is... in her writing, she's also another thing that she is, it's science fiction and it's like also like social science fiction. So her mother was like a revolutionary and a radical and wrote kind of like social criticism and also educational theory. So a lot of ideas that Mary Shelley is deconstructing are like ideas that her mother wrote. And her mother also died after childbirth with her. And that was also kind of a big part of Mary Shelley's life, this like specter of death and kind of the horrors of birth. And so, yeah, it was very important to us, especially because it is a very cinematic text in that it's been adapted like in every era of cinema, from like Thomas Edison silent film studios to like I think there's like a Frankenstein PD on Netflix now, and then the James Whale, the famous ones from the 20th century, and they all have male directors. And there's like a very male gaze, I think, and it's majority male characters in the book. But I think it is a very feminist text. And so one way that we got at that, which was taking Mary Shelley's own words and her own story that she told and using that as our outer layer and making it kind of the process of creation being a process of her grief. It's all female puppeteers in the show. We all play all the characters, so I play Victor Frankenstein and Mary Shelley. So it was one way of getting her kind of like female voice like back in it visually, since we don't have a lot of writing in the show. And we also wanted to restore birth into it, like actually. So and this is kind of new, if you saw it at court, this is new, but it opens with, Mary Shelley feeling conflicted about this pregnancy and this baby, and then her moment of horror when she realizes she's going into labor, and then the birth scene is shot kind of like, as the puppetry of that montage sequence, we very much borrowed from body horror, and kind of from the horrors of childbirth at the time. She was at a time where it was moving away from midwifery into like consolidation of power by mostly like male surgeons with kind of horrible, like lying on the bed, lots of forceps, lots of contraptions, not a very healthy way to give birth, which is partially why Mary Shelley's mother died after part of the placenta was left in her body. So we take those like kind of historical objects and like put it into like a horror sequence with Mary Shelley at the very top of the show, and that contextualizes the whole story of Frankenstein.
Okay,
Sorry,
great.
that's a lot.
No, that was great. That was great. So that's one explosion of the grand narrative. So I got to dig a little deeper for Mike. And putting together several things here. So you mentioned that various members of your company are what we would call neurodivergent. And that in particular, there's a resistance to single narratives because it doesn't make sense for people who perceive the world in that way. Yes? Okay, so I think we have Claudia Orenstein out there. Yes, okay, so Claudia is editing a volume that's forthcoming from Routledge on the puppet and the spirit, and I am contributing an essay in there. So I'm going to out myself as a different type of neurodivergent. I have PTSD, which is why I'm not coming to your show, because I don't want to get triggered.
Very fair.
But I did some research in talking about the spiritual experience of puppetry, looking at what neuroscientists are exploring and kind of validating some of Jung's insights. And so the human consciousness, we receive stimuli from so many different directions every moment of the day, but we are not able to focus on all of them at the same time. And so there are others that are playing over here on the fringes that our main consciousness, or however we want to call that, is not aware of, but it's still there. It's still part of reality. And I think one of the things that puppets do is help us recover this stuff that's in the fringes. So when you were talking about sticking your hand in and pulling out an aspect, that's what I see is happening, and we have even a scientific explanation for it at this point. So where I'm going with this, you brought up the cadavre exquis as a, sorry, I have a Francophone background, and so it's exquisite cadaver, yeah, okay. But I learned it in French, so cadavre exquis. As a way of putting narratives together, and it's it is significant that the Surrealists originally played that game with images rather than words. You know, you can do it with words, and I have done it with words. It's a lot of fun, but it was originally with images. So we actually have a fancy Greek word for this concept, which is parataxis, and that refers to the white space, the blank space, which, and it was considered to be an innovation of, or particularly important in modernist and postmodern literature, where instead of spelling everything out and leading the audience by the hand through the story and then forcing them to look in this direction, we leave space for them to bring their own interpretations into it. So that's what I heard when you were describing your process and how your shows function.
Yeah.
Yes. So now let me find a question for you in all of that. When you were talking about you can't master a puppet, you have to collaborate with the puppet. I think that, you know, that's an experience that resonates with most puppeteers, and that connects us to our post-human theme. So while I was waiting in that morass in September, the nugget that I pulled out is there's a point at which Ian Bogost, who's one of the main theorists, admits that we cannot, and the word that the phenomenologists like is apprehend. How does the consciousness engage with the material world or whatever is outside of the consciousness, if anything? So how do we the only way that we can apprehend something outside of the self is through metaphor. In other words, to tell ourselves a story about what we think we are experiencing. So if you would like to elaborate on that idea a little more as it applies to your work, is that too broad for you? Or?
Oh, no, I love too broad.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and also I love that you're writing about neuroscience and spirits in puppetry, because the show that I'm working on right now is a puppet seance that specifically dives into neuroscience. So we have I got a lot of questions for you.
Good.
Okay, and that was what I've just learned is called an attentional blink. Can you repeat the question?
Yes. Okay, there wasn't a real question. So what I'm going to try to formulate now is I was asking about how we apprehend the world and how working with puppets enables us to, you know, is the puppet a metaphor? And how do the kinds of stories that we can tell with puppets help us deal with the phenomena outside of ourselves, if there is anything outside of ourselves?
Yeah. Yeah. Right. I mean, I think there's oodles that is I don't know, whatever it is, like fundamental truth or existence or the cosmos or whatever the vast expanse of everything is clearly like, it all gets filtered through, is like ultimately this like very tiny little computer, or at least computer is our current understanding of things, and I'm sure that language will change over time as we start to realize that everything, I don't know, everything flows through different things in different ways, and the absolute vastness of human experience and all of existence is way too much. We're never gonna figure that shit out. And the metaphor makes it digestible. And I mean, I love metaphors. Like, I find it almost so, I will find myself talking almost entirely in metaphor to the point where it might not even necessarily make a whole ton of sense about what it is that I'm talking about, except that I know that it is sort of like, it is like absolutely crystal clear in my own mind what it is that is being said. And there's a phenomenon that happens with puppetry in that you create this thing and you put it in between you as the puppeteer and your audience, and it lives as this metaphor, and suddenly you talk to them afterwards, you talk to them during the show as it's occurring, and you realize that suddenly you are able to talk about the exact same thing as one another without having had to define terms or even necessarily have like shared either like cultural backgrounds or shared training or the same, because the metaphor is allowed to exist entirely as itself in the space that that you create together with one another. And it's just sort of like, it's a fast track to human connection, which is, it's one of the reasons why I keep returning to puppetry, is because sometimes it is just so much easier to talk through a doll than it is through words. So yeah, I don't know, I feel that. It feels very, very true to me, and I think that there's, yeah, I mean, just based on how many people are showing up to the Puppet Festival and the enthusiasm that there is for puppetry, and like if you say you're a puppeteer to somebody, sometimes just sort of like that intense look of delight or horror that comes across them is that you know that that they have a personal and powerful connection to that, and that means that you can get deep with one another in a way that words and other more human-based art forms don't necessarily allow.
Okay, thank you. That was a beautiful answer. Thanks for sipping from the fire hose.
I love the fire hose.
Okay, all right, so Theodora, that was where I really started to get entranced, because so many things that I've been thinking about have come together in hearing about your work. I'm going to actually ask you two questions. So the first one should be a short answer. In my forthcoming book on African American object performance, I developed the argument that African Americans have used musical instruments as performing objects because we were not allowed to use the kinds of objects that we had in Africa. And I have a whole analysis of marching band performance and the way that historically Black college marching bands have used not just their instruments, but their bodies in formation on the field as performing objects. So I wondered if you were either consciously or unconsciously also using the marching band as a performing object, or the instruments as performing objects in the Benjamin Banneker show.
I think unconsciously I was using them as performing objects. I didn't know that they would become such an interesting part of the whole piece. I mean, the way I got to a marching band was that I teach at Pratt, and we were having a ceremony to inaugurate a new president, and the administration had brought in a marching band that was from a high school 2 blocks away from Pratt. And so they just blew me away. They opened the show and they closed the event, and as they left, I literally went chasing after them to find out where they were. And I found out they were at a public high school 2 blocks from where I've been teaching. So, there were all sorts of challenges of connecting to them and working out rehearsal schedules and everything, but it brought such a great thing to the performance. Yeah. And then you start to look at the history of marching bands and taking space, and it's just a great story. I tried to work with them again, and it just didn't work out for my next piece. People's lives are fragile,
Yes.
and they change all the time. And high school, yeah.
Okay, so the second question, another thread that I follow in my book is ways that we pass down knowledge. In our culture, we preserve knowledge in the archive, if it's been written down.
Yeah.
And it can also be passed through repertoires of performance. African Americans they didn't come from societies that used written archives to pass knowledge down. And then, in any case, they were not allowed to write under slavery, so they didn't create written archives until after emancipation. But the embodied knowledge was a way of handing things down. So storytelling, I talk about, but also the craft skills. So when you said that you came from a family of seamstresses and that you were always making things, that was the case with a lot of the artists that I was studying. And then because, in particular, the quilting tradition in African American culture was so important, and the assemblage of little small scraps of things into something that is a repository of stories was really important. So I'm interested in your lineage of embodied knowledge and what you've been passing down by assembling pieces into another form of grand narrative.
Yeah, yeah. Well, first of all, I just want to say that there's a performer, and she's actually the puppet director in this piece, Grand Panorama, Kathy Shaw, who's actually written an article about the body of the puppet as an archive. So that's, definitely something that you all might be interested in. I don't know what it is about stitching together fragments. I know that they're flat, although the result isn't so-called flat, but there's something about the lateral spread of stitching together or collaging together something that's interesting. I don't know how you pass that on. I mean, it's hard to pass that on, I suppose. I think it's probably much easier to pass on grand narratives because they're hegemonic and absolutist and they can continue through generations. I don't know how you spread something that's just fragmentary performance. I don't know.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So we have to end a little bit early because this space will shortly be used by the group that's going to perform this evening. But we have about 10 minutes that we can take questions from the floor. So if you have a question, please come to one of the microphones and speak up and pose it. Oh, good. I see Claudia in motion. This should be good.
It's Claudia.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for such an interesting panel. And thank you for the shout out for the book, Puppet and Spirit, Ritual, Religion, and Performing Objects. And my co-editor is Tim Cusack. I wanted to make sure I mentioned that, and it's 2 volumes. Paulette's article is great. I am really interested in dramaturgy and I would say the negotiation or collaboration between the kind of objects and puppets and the storytelling. In the previous panel, we heard a lot from people who were just starting with materials and creating things. And although even Mike, you talk about, having these snippets of stories, right now, the more recent work on Ubu and the one you're doing at the show have actual stories that are already written, and all of you seem to have work with that. And Sarah, I was really interested in the kind of trajectory you talked about of finding new materials or new techniques along with new stories. So I'm just interested in hearing from all of you about this kind of negotiation, about the dramaturgy or the structure or manner of telling the stories with your using of objects and how you, work with that. I mean, obviously in all these different shows, they're probably all different, but I'm just curious if you give us any insights or thoughts about your your point about scale, for example,
Yeah.
Theodore, was so useful. Are there more thoughts that you have of places where discoveries happen or things change or you get stuck between one or the other? Anyway, I just think it's a really interesting topic.
Yeah.
And I'll just say, because so much, I think it is a little different of like starting and just being about the material, but then also having to think about this other idea.
Yeah. Well, I do think dramaturgy is incredibly interesting as related to puppetry, and I think scale and material are, I mean, maybe somebody's going to really develop this further. I don't have any great thoughts about it. I know it's a really rich area that somebody could really blow something up to hugely important. I mean, I just don't know what the other elements are. Scale, materiality, I don't know. What else are some things? I mean, there must be a way that music and rhythm also factors in. It's so critical to all of us who work in puppetry. But I don't know, do you guys have more thoughts?
Yeah, I found that like dramaturgy and puppetry is like incredibly humbling, in the best way, because we are really story based. Like we start with a story and then we hit materials, and we find that especially when we're working with like tech kind of stuff, like it works best if that language like emerges out of a need of the story. But that being, and then we storyboard out everything, like every single shot. Gets like storyboarded and then fabricated, and then we come together and stage and get scored. So there's like a lot of pre-pro. But that being said, with like all the focus on story, like we stage something for the first time and then it never works. And we haven't like quite like put that into the production timeline. But I would like all of our shows we've remade like 3 times, because I think in puppetry you never discover like actually what the thing is until, kind of like Mike said, it exists between you and the audience. Mm-hmm. And I think especially shadows leave so much room for projection of self from the audience. Like it is a dance between us, between puppeteer and audience, and we don't know what that's like until we get there. So now we've had to kind of admit to ourselves, like, we are gonna have to remake the show 3 times. Like, how can we like make that a controlled process instead of an inevitable like rolling madness?
Yeah, I think that's great. That back and forth process. Like, I feel like time is almost a dramaturg, in that you have materials and it's going to do things that you don't know and you can't expect, and sometimes what it wants to do is not going to serve the story that you're trying to make. Yeah. And so what we have, like our attic and garage and all spaces are like starting to fill up with this sort of like ongoing material library of things that said something really strong to us at some point, but it might have been the wrong thing at the time when we were trying to squeeze it into Ubu, or Invitation to a Beheading. It doesn't always, it doesn't always jive. But, and why, I don't know why, like, arts funding is so, like, one of the things that is so critical about it is that, like, to actually create something that is, that has not been created before, you need to have that. I think there's no, I can't imagine any replacing that amount of experience, of that back and forth of trying it and putting it in front of people and seeing, because it's like you feel it when it's not working, and like when, and I guess that's what I sort of mean by like time as dramaturg, is that like it will, the dramaturg helps make the all of the elements of the production cohere with each other so that they're speaking the same conversation. And what time will do is like it will just sort of tell, like you can have the best idea in the world and you can keep on trying to try and make it work, but like if the object doesn't want to do it, it would be great to just be able to identify in the moment of like, no, it's really not, because it's like sometimes it does end up working out, but in a different way than you expected. And yeah, I don't know how to figure that out without giving it several chances.
You know, I also think that the life of a dramaturg in the U.S. is a very fragile profession. There are very few full-time dramaturgs. I remember being in Germany once and in a theater, and I was walking down the hallway, and to my right and to my left, I would see labels on the door, dramaturg, 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 and I thought, these are like full-time salaried people that this theater has 7 dramaturgs, and in the US, we probably, I don't know, have 20 paid dramaturgs in the whole country. And I think that, you know, it's, you know, great innovative things could come from us focusing on it, but I think that that's where you really need financial support, you know, is in, you know, dramaturgy. And I would imagine a puppetry dramaturg is even a more specialized, amazing, rarefied person who can not only look under the bones of a text, but who can also understand the relationship between puppetry, the performer, and the text. So it's a great topic to chew on for a long time. It's going to have great rewards, you know?
Okay. Thank you for your question, Claudia. We can take one more, I think, and then we unfortunately have to clear the space. So please, Cammie.
Thank you. I have a two-part question. Number one, at what age would you say you officially entered the puppetry world? And number two, do you have any recommendations on how we can get the puppetry arts and the importance of storytelling introduced into our high schools in our country? Thank you.
I can go. So my grandfather did kind of like Punch and Judy style, like extremely violent, amazing puppet shows at all of the Christmas and birthday parties. Yeah, yes, very lucky, very over the top, kind of like Howdy Doody, but like lots of like, you know, like alligators biting off heads and snakes coming out of cans, and I loved them. And then I thought I was going to be a scientist. But after college, I was doing a lot of physical theater, and through that fell into doing object work, and from that into puppetry. So probably not until my 20s, like mid-20s, did I come to puppetry as a profession. Yeah, that's a good question about high schools, and I do, you know, it's when we were touring, it was like harder for me to like get into high schools and do workshops, but I try to do as many as I can, and that was actually a weird silver lining of the pandemic, was I was able to zoom into a lot more schools than then in the years leading up to it, I had gotten to visit. You know, and I think puppetry is great because you know, there's a lot of students who, it's like a very interdisciplinary art form, and it leaves rooms for like lots of different ways of thinking and lots of different ways of creating. And I think there's students who like want to tell stories, but maybe don't necessarily want to be on stage, which I think is something that came up in a lot of the other talks. And puppetry can like really, you know, give you an outlet for that. And also I think puppetry works really well with frames, and like TikTok and like video work with your phone, like gives you a frame. And like people are doing such like innovative, interesting things through like the way that the evolution of the foam frame, and like puppetry works super well with that, and it's a great lo-fi way for special effects. Yeah. So yeah, I think it's like extremely relevant to high schoolers, and also we just need more arts funding to like get them the materials. Though they're creating a lot of like videos and stuff on their own, you know.
Yeah. For me, it was. I mean, like always, I've been drawn to objects, but I think high school also was I was in a Jewish summer camp that this particular session was like focused on the arts, and we were close family friends with the director of the summer camp, and nobody had signed up for the puppetry elective. And I wanted to be in acting, and she just shoved me into the puppetry class. And which initially I was like sort of horrified, and then the puppeteer, Heidi, if anybody knows Heidi, I need to find her, helped me like build a whole Muppet, and I got to have like a little solo show at the end of things to be able to just like roast all of camp. And it was this incredible moment of just like seeing the possibility in a time where I was in such a transitional phase, and like it really stuck with me in and was just like such a singular experience. And I think that there's probably not necessarily one age, but like it really has to sort of like repeat itself at different times. And so really capturing all ages, and high schoolers especially, yeah, I don't know. It's really just sort of like give money to puppeteers, and they will, and tell them it's for high schoolers, and they'll go to the high schoolers, because I really do think that but being able to like provide that performance experience, being able to have just sort of like that catalytic moment, which can happen on stage, and can happen in performances in this like totally ecstatic sort of way. If you're able to provide that for folks, I think they can, potentially be chasing it for the rest of their lives.
When I was in high school, I made a deal with my sister, and when she got her driver's license on Sundays, we told our parents that we were going to the library, and I would put paint all over myself and, 500 feathers or 2,800 walnut shells or something, and we'd get in the car, and we'd go to Golden Gate Park, and my sister was instructed to leave the motor running because I didn't know if a performance was going to work or not. And I would walk outside, and I would go to where there were clusters of people, and I would do these performances that were 90 seconds long if they didn't work, and maybe 5 minutes long if they did work. And then I would get back in the car, and then I would take olive oil and wipe everything off. And my sister and I would go back home after having done these Sunday performances. So I knew that I was making something artistic, but I didn't know what it was, and I didn't know it had anything to do with puppetry. That came much later because, there's a great burst of fabulous puppetry everywhere in this country, but decades ago, when I was a young artist, there wasn't. So I didn't know that it was puppetry until I, cut the arms off of that self-portrait and got it moving around. High school. Well, a lot of teaching artists do great puppet workshops on elementary and middle school. And yeah, it's more rare in high school. Yeah, and it could be used very differently and very powerfully. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, thank all of the panelists. Oh, I'm sorry. We really have to go. But as we leave the stage, if you can buttonhole people, you can ask your question then. Yes, Blair.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everyone, so much for all this, our panelists. Awesome. A very lovely afternoon and morning with discussions on work and to hear where this stuff originates from. Just to make a little plug, we have the Spoken Bird Cafe is open up on the 4th floor, and the exhibits, if you haven't had a chance to see them, please stop by there and have an espresso and a little empanada. So there's obviously there's a bunch of more shows to see. There's going to be one here in this theater in 2 hours, the last performance of Plexus Polaire. And I know a lot of shows you may know are sold out, which is a really exciting thing. It's not like actually all of the shows, but there's several shows that are sold out. I actually kind of feel, since this is a small group, I'm going to advocate for, like, if that's the case and you're in town and you really want to see the show, show up to the theater and get into the theater. Sandy doesn't want to hear me saying this, but just get yourself into there's going to be a spot for you. I always tell my students there's a place to go around and climb under the tent flap and get in. Do not miss the show. It's happening now. So thank you very much.